Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to talk about exposing film using the internal meter in your camera. I'm going to share a few different tips that'll really help you kind of nail your exposures moving forward. And then I'm also going to share a few images of mine and talk a little bit about my approach. So I do own an external meter, this Sekonic. It's a spot meter and an incident. And obviously I use this for all of my 4x5 and large format work. I use it a little bit with the other formats, but I would say for the most part with 6.7, 6.45 and 35, I'm almost always using the internal meters in these cameras, and they've worked great as long as I'm just careful with my approach. And obviously a handheld meter is going to give you the most flexibility and accuracy, and if you can afford one, they're a really great way to understand how to read the light in your scene a little bit better. But I would say they're not a necessity, and as long as you take the time to understand how the meter in your camera works and just develop your technique a little bit, you can get really great results. So today, like I said, going to talk about 3 tips that I think can really help you out and talk a little bit about my approach as well. So let's jump into things. So the first tip, and one of the most important, is just understanding how the meter in your camera works. So basically when you're looking through the viewfinder, just knowing like which area of the frame it's focused on the most and where it's kind of pulling that reading from. And this is something that's going to vary between camera manufacturers and models, sometimes drastically, but I would say for the most part, center weighted metering on these older film cameras is what's most common. It's what this Contax RTS is. Same with this Bronica ETRS. And then this Pentax 672 has 3 different metering modes, but I almost always leave it in the center weighted mode. And basically it's exactly how it sounds. So center weighted focuses heavily on the center of the frame and then usually tapers off to the sides and the bottom, and often avoids kind of the top portion of the frame entirely. This will differ a little bit between manufacturers, but what I would recommend, if you've never looked this up before, Google your camera's manual online. For sure in there it'll list the metering mode that it has, and then oftentimes they'll even show you like an image of the viewfinder with like a representation of the coverage of the meter. With this Bronica, for example, you can see from the image here in the manual, they actually show you the coverage, and then they have numbers listed in these different zones that just kind of represents like the strength, and you can see they get weaker as it tapers out. The Pentax 672 as well, in that manual, they have this kind of like 3D image or graph that shows the pattern for the center weighted meter. Same thing, very strong in the middle, tapers out to the sides and the bottom, and then avoids the top entirely. So a lot of these center weighted meters are going to operate in a very similar way, but if you can, look up the manual and just try and understand as much as you can about it. Really the goal is to know when you're looking through the viewfinder, just to be able to look at the scene and figure out if there's anything in it that could potentially throw off the reading that your camera is giving you. And that's what we're going to talk about actually in the second point. So next up is just to decide what's most important in your scene. And obviously, once you understand how the meter in your camera works, you can really start to look through that viewfinder, like I said, and figure out if there's anything that could potentially throw off the exposure that it's going to give you. So what we're going to do is we're going to hop on the computer for this next point. I'm going to show you a few different images. I think I have like 6 here. These are all shot with either the RTS or the Pentax, and I'm gonna just walk you through like what I was looking at in this scene and if there was any adjustments I made to get my reading. So let's get into it here. Okay, so this first one is an image I actually just made on a trip I was on last week. Shot mainly color, but this is some black and white stuff on the RTS that I just shot kind of for fun, but I thought this first image would be a good example. So this was shot on HP5. And with this scene, this was later in the day, and you can see, obviously it's like a kind of like a backlit scene, although the sun was behind the clouds. But what happened is the sky became incredibly bright, especially up in kind of this half of the scene here. And then a lot of the foreground was just darker. And obviously, looking through the viewfinder, I knew that it was important to obviously make sure I'm recording some density in the negative in these like mid-tone and shadow areas. But I knew just because the sky is so bright that there's the potential that that is going to throw off the reading it's giving me. Even with it being center weighted, that still will affect it at times. So if I just took my picture as is with the reading that my camera was giving me, there's a good chance that I would have been lacking information in this kind of foreground area. So Super easy. All that I did, and this is what I do often with scenes like this where the sky is really bright, but maybe the foreground isn't that bright, is I'll just kind of tilt the camera down a little bit and remove like half of the sky. So there's just a little bit of it in the top of the frame. And I'll take my reading that way, kind of focused on the foreground, set my exposure, and then I'll go and reframe and shoot the image. And basically by doing that, I'm just making sure that the exposure reading my camera is giving me is for this foreground, so I know I'm going to have, plenty of information or density there on the negative when I develop it. And of course, this is a good way to work if you're using negative film, which I'm sure most people are. If you're shooting with slide film, you don't have that much flexibility because, shooting HP5, I knew that if I expose for the foreground here, these highlights are still going to hold just because that film does have quite a bit of flexibility with its exposure range. The next image, this is kind of completely different. This is from, I think, the next day, but I wanted to show you this one just because this is a scene where the tones are fairly even across the frame. There's some brighter tones here on this old camper, but there's nothing in here that was going to throw it off. So I would have just, framed up my picture with this camera and shot it. I know there's nothing in there that's gonna throw off my meter. The sky is a little bit brighter, but there's not this like really high contrast throughout the scene, so I didn't have to make any adjustments. And then similar with this one, so this was the Pentax 672, just like an overcast morning, a little bit of like light fog or mist here. And then same idea, looking through the viewfinder, in center weighted mode, I would have been happy just to move ahead with the reading my camera was giving me as is. I didn't have to make any adjustments because again, there wasn't this high contrast range throughout this image. And then one more here, this is Pentax 672. This is Portra 160, I think. Again, a very flexible film, but looking at this scene in the center weighted mode, again, it's not a really high contrast scene. There is obviously like this bright patch of sky here, but fairly confident that I could just point my camera at the scene as is, and the reading is going to be fine. But then kind of, going back to what happened in that first scene, this is with the Pentax 6.7 as well. Obviously this is at sunset, very bright sky, the sun's just setting over here. So this would have been a scenario with this camera where I knew, okay, if I just frame this up and shoot with the reading it's giving me, there's a very good chance that the foreground and the vehicle here is going to be lacking density on the negative, just because the bright sky really would have been affecting my meter and it probably would have underexposed a little bit. So again, for this image, as simple as just, pointing the camera down a little bit to remove, in this case, I would say quite a decent section of that sky, or could even be, panning over a little bit to remove the brightest part, getting my reading, setting my exposure, and then going back and reframing and taking the shot. And then one more here. So this is very different than any of the other ones we looked at. This is Pentax 672 with, I think, HP5. But scenes like this are just another scenario where you have to kind of think about what the camera might be doing. So obviously we saw the examples with the bright sky, trying to remove that to get our reading. But in a scene like this, a foggy morning where it's really kind of low contrast and there's like this like softness across the entire frame. Obviously this fog's like blanketing the landscape. On this day when I was shooting, I actually overexposed all of my images by a stop, at least based on what the meter was giving me, just because I knew, okay, if I'm pulling most of my exposure from the center portion, and in a lot of these scenes with the fog, it's just this like blanket of white fog, a lot of these are going to be underexposed because obviously, with a center weighted meter, it's giving you like this averaged exposure for middle gray where it's taking into account a number of tones within this range and giving you an average reading for middle gray. So in scenarios like this with fog, that would lead to underexposure. Obviously, you hear all the time with like snowy scenes where there's a lot of reflected, really intense light. Same thing with those, if you expose acids, for this averaged middle gray reading, they're going to be underexposed. So this was a scene, like I said, this entire day I was probably shooting HP5 at 200 for like a stop of overexposure just to make sure none of these foggy scenes were lacking any information. So really important when you're looking through the viewfinder, just to really think about what's most important in that scene, what you definitely want to be exposed properly, to have some density on the negative, and then to see if there's anything that could potentially throw your meter reading off. make adjustments to take your reading, and then recompose. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is just cheating your meter a little bit by intentionally overexposing your film. And again, this would apply to negative film, not to slide film. And the way you would do this, as I'm sure many of you know, is just setting your meter a little bit lower, your ISO rating. So if you're shooting 400, you could set it at like 320 or 250 or 200, or just using exposure compensation if you're using an automatic mode. And this is something that I almost do all the time when I'm using an internal meter system. And my reasoning for this is, over the years, I've done a bunch of exposure tests on negative films. And I know that the film stocks that I like to use, definitely at 1 stop, but even sometimes at 2 stops of overexposure, there's almost zero difference in terms of like color and sharpness and grain. But on the flip side, at like half a stop or a stop of underexposure, you do start to notice a difference in the shadows. They start to get like a little bit muddy, a little bit grainy. So I personally would always rather have a negative that has a little bit more density compared to one that has like some thin areas in the shadows and things like that. So when I was doing my American West work, shot on 35mm film, Portra 400, I almost always shot it at ISO 200, just again to make sure that I had lots of information in those areas, and I could then kind of edit the images to the style that I like. That's like this lifted shadow, really bright look. So this really just all comes down to understanding the film stocks you like to work with. Like I said, I've done a bunch of tests on this channel you can check out or do ones of your own. But my thinking is I'd always rather have a negative that is a little more dense compared to one that's thin, and it just gives you a little bit of insurance as well, when you're cheating your meter or using exposure compensation, just in case you get into a situation where your camera gets fooled by the scene, or if you make a mistake, you're still going to probably have an image that's going to scan just fine. Okay, so I hope that these tips help you out. Like I said at the start, an external meter is a really valuable tool to own as a film photographer. If you can afford one, I'd highly recommend it. But they're not an absolute necessity depending on the type of work that you do. I think what's most important is really just understanding the tools that you work with as best as possible, and also the film stocks that you like to work with. And for me, as I mentioned, I've been using a number of different cameras over the years with the internal meter systems, and I've always been very happy with the results that I've gotten. So anyways, just want to say thank you as always for watching. If you have any questions about this, leave them below. I'll try my best to help. Other than that, I will see you next week.